The sky split with a deafening crack, metal shrieking as the jet plummeted into the muddy delta, the river swallowing the fire and the screams all at once. People fled. They didn't look back, but Bina Ekiye, barefoot and shaking, dove straight into the oil-streaked deep. Through the dark water and sinking debris she saw him, a man in a torn suit, unconscious and trapped, going down with the wreckage. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his worth. She only knew he would die if she walked away. So she didn't. By morning, the river was quiet again, but her life was not, because 5 black choppers were already hovering over the trees. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? And if stories like this move you, take a second to subscribe. Bina Ekiye woke before the sun rose, as she always did. In the dim blue light of early morning, the Niger Delta carried the smell of damp wood, river water, and smoke from cooking fires that never truly went out. Her small wooden shack creaked as she pushed aside the thin curtain that served as a door. The river stretched endlessly before her, quiet, now almost innocent, as if it had not swallowed pieces of a burning plane just hours ago. For a brief moment she stood still. Her body ached. Her arms still trembled from the weight she had dragged through the water the night before. Her palms were blistered. There were cuts along her legs she didn't even remember getting. And yet none of that frightened her as much as the memory itself. The fire, the screams, the man. Bina swallowed hard and looked back inside. On the worn mat in the corner lay her father, his face etched with a worry that never left. He stirred, eyes opening halfway. "Bina, you're awake." "I never slept," she said softly, forcing a smile. That was a lie. But it was the kind of lie she told every day. The kind meant to protect him from a world that gave them nothing. "Did you fix the net?" he asked weakly. "Not yet," she replied. "But I will. Today will be better." Another lie. The jet was a silver needle threading through the vast blue silence of the sky, high above the world where the air was thin and the weight of the earth felt far away. Seong-min sat in the quiet of the cabin, the hum of the engines a steady pulse beneath his feet, while the soft leather of his seat held him in a comfort that cost more than most men saw in a lifetime. To anyone watching, he was the image of absolute power, a man whose signature could move mountains and whose silence could shake boardrooms. But as he stared out the window at the endless white floor of clouds, his reflection was a mask of cold composure, hiding a spirit that felt as empty as the space between the stars. He had built an empire from nothing, but in the process he had become a stranger to himself. A soft chime echoed in the stillness, and Seong-min reached for his phone, his fingers steady but distant. The screen flickered to life, and there it was. A simple text message from Seoul that made his chest tighten in a way no business deal ever could. "Safe flight, Papa." It was from 7-year-old Hannah, her voice reaching out from across the ocean to find him in his isolation. For a brief moment, the armor he wore against the world seemed to soften, and he allowed himself to imagine her small face and the light in her eyes. She was the only thing real in a life made of glass and steel, the only truth he had left to hold on to. He started to type a reply, but he stopped, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. The world below was changing, the green expanse of the delta beginning to rise up through the haze, beautiful and dangerous all at once. He didn't know that his daughter's message would be the last piece of home he would touch for a long time. He didn't know that the silence of the cabin was about to be shattered by the shriek of metal and the roar of the wind. He simply sat there, a powerful man in a fragile cage of silver, unaware that his life was already beginning to slip through his fingers. The sky remained innocent for one more heartbeat, keeping its secrets until it was too late to turn back. The river was a vast, moving mirror of liquid lead, reflecting a sky that held its breath under the heavy heat of the afternoon. Bina sat in the bow of the wooden canoe, her eyes scanning the familiar curves of the delta where the water met the thick, tangled green of the shore. Beside her, the rhythm of her father's paddle was the only sound in the world, a steady dip and splash that felt like the heartbeat of the river itself. They had been out for hours, the air thick with the scent of salt and turning earth, but the nets remained light, a silent reminder of the struggle that waited for them back at the village. To the world, the delta was a place of endless resources, but to Bina and her father, it was a beautiful, demanding master that gave only what it chose to let go. Bina adjusted her seat, the rough wood of the canoe pressing against her skin as she watched a hawk circle high above, a tiny speck of life in the immense blue. Her father didn't speak, his face set in the quiet determination of a man who had spent his life fighting the current to Kess, where the light filtered through the leaves in dusty streaks and the water turned dark and secretive to keep his family whole. There was a heaviness in his shoulders that she recognized, a weight that came from knowing that hope was a fragile thing when the stomach was empty. She wanted to tell him that today would be different, that the river would finally open its hands, but the words felt like another lie she wasn't ready to tell. They moved deeper into the shadows of the mangrove. Suddenly the stillness felt wrong. The birds that usually filled the trees with their chatter were silent, and the air seemed to thicken with a tension she couldn't name. Bina felt a shiver trace its way down her spine, a cold touch in the middle of the heat. She looked at her father and she saw that he had stopped paddling, his head tilted as if listening to a sound that hadn't reached her yet. The river was suddenly too quiet, too innocent, as if it were hiding a truth that was about to break the surface. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still, suspended between the life they knew and the one that was rushing toward them from the clouds. They didn't know that the silver needle in the sky had already begun its fall. They only knew that the shadows were growing longer and the river was no longer their friend. The silence of the high altitude was a fragile mask, a thin veil of peace that vanished in a heartbeat as the air itself seemed to turn into a wall of iron. There was no warning, only a sudden violent tremor that made the massive frame of the jet groan like a living thing in agony. Seong-min's phone slipped from his hand, the screen still glowing with his daughter's message as he was thrown against the window, the world outside turning into a blurred streak of gray and fire. Then came the sound, a deafening crack that drowned out the wind, the scream of metal tearing apart as the plane split midair. The pressurized cabin exploded into a chaos of freezing air and flying debris, the comfort of the leather seats replaced by a savage, weightless fall. Everything was moving too fast for fear to take hold, a nightmare of spinning clouds and the roar of the sky rushing into the broken fuselage. Seong-min gripped the armrest, his knuckles turning white as the floor beneath him tilted toward the earth, the silver needle now a broken wing plunging through the haze. He saw the faces of the people around him, masks of terror frozen in the flickering light of the cabin, their shouts swallowed by the immense noise of the descent. The green expanse of the delta rushed up to meet them, no longer a distant map but a hard, unforgiving reality of mud and water. He felt the stomach-churning drop, the weight of his own body pressing into the seat as the gravity of the world claimed its prize. Impact was not a sound, but a force that shattered the very idea of time, a wall of water and metal slamming into his senses with a violence that turned the world black. The plane hit the river with a thud that echoed across the quiet banks, the force of it tearing through the structure and scattering wreckage across the oil-streaked surface. Cold water surged into the cabin instantly, dark and unstoppable, drowning the fire and the screams in a heavy, suffocating silence. Seong-min felt his head snap forward, a flash of white pain blinding him as he sank into the murky depths, trapped in a cage of twisted steel. He drifted between the light above and the dark below, his breath slipping away as the river closed its hand over the man who thought he held the world. The explosion echoed across the river like a thunderclap from the heart of the earth, a thick column of black smoke rising into the sky as a grim warning of the life that was slipping away beneath the waves. Bina didn't remember deciding to move. 1 second she was standing in the trembling canoe, her heart hammering against her ribs, and the next her body had already turned toward the fire. Ignoring her father's shout, she leaped into the oil-streaked deep. The water hit her like a wall, cold, violent, and crushing, stealing the breath from her lungs and shocking her entire body into stillness. The heat from the flames above vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating chill that clawed into her bones as she sank into the dark, murky silence of the delta. But she didn't stop. She forced her limbs to move, pushing through the resistance of the heavy oil-slicked water, kicking hard as she fought her way toward the sinking wreckage. Debris floated everywhere, pieces of metal jutting out at impossible angles that brushed against her skin in the gloom. Something cut her arm and another piece of debris struck her shoulder, but she ignored the pain, her eyes stinging as she searched for the man she had seen through the smoke. The current fought her, dragging her sideways and trying to pull her into the mouth of the river, but she tightened her resolve and pushed deeper. There, half submerged and caught between twisted metal, she found him. He was wedged beneath a bent section of the fuselage, his head barely above the surging water, his face pale beneath the soot and grease. Fear took hold as she realized how heavy he was and how fast the wreckage was sinking into the mud. "You can't do this," a voice inside her whispered. "You'll die too." Bina clenched her teeth, the words lost beneath the roar of the water. "I'm not leaving him," she muttered to the dark. She dove under, the cold swallowing her again as her hands searched blindly along the metal until she found what held him down. Her fingers slipped, struggling to find a grip on the slick surface. She pushed with everything she had, her muscles screaming and her vision blurring as her lungs demanded the air she refused to give them. "Move," she screamed inside her mind. The metal shifted a little, then suddenly it gave way. Bina grabbed the man's arm immediately, pulling with a strength she didn't know she had as his body finally came free. He was dead weight, limp and unresponsive, but she kicked upward, dragging him toward the light that flickered on the surface. She broke the water gasping, pulling in air like it was the only thing left in the world. Her hand locked onto the stranger as the river tried one last time to take them both. The light above was a pale, flickering promise, a thin silver veil that seemed to move further away with every frantic kick of Bina's legs. Beneath the oil-slicked surface, the river was a heavy, suffocating tomb, the pressure of the deep clawing at her chest as she fought to keep her grip on the man's torn suit. He was a dead weight, a cold anchor of leather and soaked wool that threatened to drag them both into the soft, hungry mud of the delta floor. Every muscle in her small frame screamed in protest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that echoed in the silent dark of the water. She could feel the strength draining from her fingers, her lungs burning with a fire that only the air could quench, yet she refused to let go. The current was a silent thief, swirling around them with a strength that felt like a physical hand trying to peel her away from the stranger. Debris from the shattered jet brushed against her, sharp and unforgiving, but she felt nothing but the desperate need to reach the sky. Her vision began to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges of the silver light, and for a moment, the weight felt truly too heavy to bear. "Not here," she screamed inside the quiet of her mind, the thought a silent plea to a river that had no mercy. She gave one last agonizing surge, her feet finding purchase against a piece of sinking metal, and pushed with everything she had left. The surface broke with a gasp that was half sob, the air hitting her face like a physical blow as she dragged the man's head into the light. She was shaking, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts that scraped her throat, but she held his chin above the murky water with a grip born of pure desperation. Around her, the river was a chaos of floating wreckage and thick black smoke that choked the lungs, the innocence of the morning gone forever. She looked toward the shore, the distance feeling like 1,000 miles, her arms trembling so violently she wasn't sure she could take another stroke. But then she saw the wooden canoe cutting through the haze, her father's face a mask of terror and love as he paddled toward them. She tightened her hold on the unconscious boss, her blistered palms stinging in the salt, and waited for the hands that would save them both. She had pulled him from the dark, but the weight of the night was only just beginning to settle on her shoulders. The river was a vast, heaving beast, its dark surface slick with oil and choked by the thick black smoke that turned the afternoon into a premature night. Bina's father reached for them, his wooden canoe rocking violently as he leaned over the edge, his face a mask of raw terror and desperation. He grabbed the man first, hauling the heavy, waterlogged body over the side with a strength born of pure adrenaline, the rough wood groaning under the sudden weight. But as he turned back for Bina, his heart stopped. She was barely above the surface, her face ash-pale, her eyes rolling back as she slipped beneath the oil-slicked waves. She had given everything to the stranger, and now the river was coming to collect its debt. He lunged forward, his fingers locking around her wrist just as the current tried to pull her away into the murky deep. He pulled her in, her small body limp and cold, her breathing a shallow, wet struggle that tore at his soul. "Bina! Bina, look at me!" he cried, but there was no answer, only the sound of the water lapping against the hull and the distant crackle of the burning plane. He sat in the middle of the small boat, looking from his fading daughter to the unconscious man in the torn suit. He was alone in the middle of the delta with 2 lives slipping through his fingers, and the village was miles away against a current that felt like a wall of stone. It was a cruel choice, a weight no father should ever have to carry, to save the girl who was his world or the stranger she had nearly died to rescue. He chose both. With a roar that was half prayer and half defiance, he gripped the paddle, his muscles bulging as he drove the blade into the thick, resistant water. Every stroke was a battle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird as he fought the river for every inch of progress. He didn't look at the smoke. He didn't look at the wreckage. He only looked at Bina, her head resting against the stranger's chest, both of them suspended between life and death in a wooden shell. The sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the water, but he didn't slow down. His palms were blistered, his back felt like it was breaking, but he paddled with a desperate rhythmic fury that defied the exhaustion in his bones. The river tried to push them back, the wind rising to fight his efforts, but he refused to give in. He had to reach the village. He had to bring them home. By the time the first huts appeared in the dim light of dusk, his breath was a ragged sob, his body running on nothing but the hope he refused to let die. He had survived the crash, but as he pulled the canoe onto the muddy bank, he knew the real storm was only just beginning to gather. The night was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the village, the air thick with the scent of stagnant mud and the lingering bitterness of aviation fuel. Inside the small hut, the flickering light of a single tallow candle danced across the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to close in on the girl lying on the mat. Bina's skin was no longer the deep, healthy bronze of the river. It had turned a dull, sickly gray slick with a cold sweat that pooled in the hollows of her collarbone. She had pulled a man from the mouth of death, but the river had left its mark deep inside her, the oily, toxic water she had swallowed now turning her body into a battlefield. Every breath she took was a wet, heavy struggle, a sound that cut through the silence of the room like a blade. Her father sat beside her, his large, calloused hands trembling as he wiped her brow with a damp cloth. He had survived the storms of the Delta and the cruelty of the seasons, but he had no armor against the sight of his only child fading before his eyes. "Bina, stay with me," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of a grief he wasn't ready to name. She didn't answer, her head tossing fitfully from side to side as she drifted through a fevered nightmare of dark water and sinking metal. To the world, the rescue was a miracle, but in the quiet of this hut, it felt like a curse. The man she had saved lay in the opposite corner, a silent witness to the price she was paying for his life, his own breathing steady while hers faltered. The hours stretched into an endless loop of heat and shivering, the light of the candle burning low until it was nothing more than a dying spark. Bina's pulse was a frantic, shallow beat beneath her father's thumb, a tiny rhythm that seemed to be losing its fight against the stillness. He looked at the shadows, then back at the door, praying for a morning that felt like it would never come. He had no medicine, no doctors, nothing but the desperate hope of a man who had already given everything to the river. The darkness was a vast, hungry thing, and as the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, he realized that Bina was slipping into a place where his voice could no longer reach her. The river was quiet now, almost innocent, as if it were not waiting to swallow the last of the light from his world. Another lie. The dawn did not break with the soft touch of the sun, but with a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth, a thundering sound that tore through the morning mist and sent the birds screaming into the sky. It was an unfamiliar thunder, a heavy rhythmic beat that vibrated in the chest and rattled the wooden beams of the huts. The quiet of the village was shattered in an instant. People ran out into the dim light, their eyes wide with a terror they had never known, staring up at the 5 black shapes that emerged from the clouds like iron giants. These were not the spirits of the river, but machines of metal and power, 5 helicopters hovering over the trees, their blades whipping the water into a frenzy and flattening the high grass of the delta. Word had spread fast, faster than the current, faster than the wind, that an international executive had survived a crash in the heart of the mud. The world had come looking for its own. As the elite rescue teams descended from the sky, their movements were a blur of dark uniforms and silver equipment, a display of wealth and force that made the village seem smaller, more fragile than it ever had before. The villagers stood in awe, huddled together against the wind of the rotors, watching as the strangers took control of the land. For a brief moment, the air was filled with the smell of fuel and the heat of the engines, a violent intrusion of the future into a world that lived by the tide. Inside the shack, the thunder was a physical weight, making the dust dance on the floor and the thin curtains sway as if in a storm. Seong-min was awake now. He lay on the worn mat, his body weak and broken, his mind a haze of pain and memory, but the sound of the blades told him he was no longer lost. He was alive. He looked at the ceiling, then at the door, the confusion in his eyes slowly giving way to a realization of what had been spent to keep him here. His first question wasn't about the rescuers. It wasn't about his company or his wealth. Where is the girl? His voice was barely more than a breath, a faint sound swallowed by the noise outside. He looked toward the corner where Bina lay, her breathing still a shallow struggle, her father sitting beside her like a silent guardian. When Seong-min saw her, something shifted in him, a crack appearing in the armor he had worn for a lifetime. This wasn't just survival. This was a life he owed to a child who had nothing. As the rescuers burst through the door, their voices sharp and commanding, he ignored their hands. He only watched the girl who had defied the river. The morning had brought the world back to him, but as he felt the strength of the choppers lifting them toward the sky, he knew he was leaving a piece of his soul behind in the mud. Another lie. The world returned to him in a rush of white light and the sharp antiseptic scent of a reality that felt far too clean to be true. Seong-min's eyes opened to a ceiling that was not made of thatch or wood, but of a smooth, sterile white that reflected the hum of machines he had long ago learned to trust. For a moment, the crash was only a fading echo, a nightmare of fire and sinking metal that his mind tried to push into the dark. He lay in the high-tech embrace of the rescue ship, his body wrapped in bandages, his chest tight with a pain that made every breath a reminder of the gravity he had fought and lost. He was a man of logic, a man who believed that everything had a price and a place, but as he looked at the 4 lines and the quiet, busy doctors, he felt a void that no medicine could fill. His thoughts were a tangled mess of silver wings and murky water, but through the haze one image remained steady, a pair of small dark hands reaching through the oil slicked deep. He remembered the cold. He remembered the weight of the river. And he remembered the face of a girl who had seen him not as a boss or a billionaire, but as a soul that was slipping away. He tried to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest, his head swimming with the shock of being alive when the sky had told him he should be dead. The doctors rushed to his side, their voices a blur of professional comfort and technical terms, but he pushed their hands away with a strength born of a sudden desperate need to know the truth. Where is the girl? His voice was a thin, dry sound, a scratch against the silence of the room. He looked from face to face, searching for an answer that wasn't in their charts or their monitors. They told him he was safe. They told him he was being taken to the best facility in the city. They spoke of his recovery and his company, but he didn't care. He needed to know about the one who had stayed when everyone else ran. He needed to know if the river had taken her in exchange for him. When he finally saw the worry etched into the distance of his assistant's gaze, he understood that survival was not a gift, but a debt he hadn't yet begun to pay. He looked out the window at the delta receding beneath them, a vast green mouth that kept its secrets well, and he knew that his life no longer belonged to the boardrooms of Seoul. It belonged to a hut in the mud. Another lie. The silence of the village was a heavy, living thing, a stillness that felt more profound than the roar of the engines that had once torn the sky apart. Seong-min stood before the small, sagging hut, the polished leather of his shoes pressing into the dark, damp earth that had held him when he was nothing but a broken body. To the world, he was a giant returned to his throne, but as he looked at the thin, weathered curtain that served as a door, he felt smaller than he had ever been. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke in the river, a smell that now lived in the back of his throat, a constant reminder of the murky deep he had almost called home. He had spent his life in buildings made of glass and steel, places designed to make men feel untouchable, yet none of them held the weight of this single creaking shack. He pushed aside the curtain, the light from outside spilling across the uneven floor in a long, dusty beam. Inside, the room was dim and quiet, the only sound the steady, shallow breath of the girl lying on the mat. Bina looked so small, her frame swallowed by the rough cloth that wrapped her, her face still carrying the gray pallor of the fever. Her father stood as Seong-min entered, his large, calloused hands resting on his daughter's shoulder, his eyes filled with a pride and a fear that no boardroom could ever understand. There was no desk between them, no contracts to sign, only the raw, naked truth of a life saved and a life nearly lost. Seong-min looked at the girl who had dived into the oil and the fire, and he realized that all his billions were nothing but paper in the face of such courage. "I didn't come to say thank you," Seong-min said, his voice thick with an emotion he had spent decades trying to forget. He knelt on the hard ground, ignoring the ache in his own mending bones, and reached out to touch the edge of the mat. Bina's eyes opened halfway, a flicker of recognition crossing her face as she looked at the man she had pulled from the wreckage. She didn't ask for a reward. She didn't ask for a change in her destiny. She only watched him with a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to see right through the suit and the title to the man underneath. Seong-min swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest like the river current. This wasn't just a visit. This was a reckoning. He had arrived with the world at his back, but as he looked at Bina, he knew he was the one who was truly poor. Today will be better, he thought, but the words stayed in his heart, a promise he was finally ready to keep. Another lie. The news didn't just travel. It erupted like a wildfire across the digital horizon, a surge of light and sound that bridged the gap between the silent, muddy banks of the Delta and the gleaming towers of the world's great cities. Within hours, the image of the shattered silver jet was flickering on every screen from London to Tokyo, a grim spectacle of fire and water that held millions in a state of breathless suspense. But it wasn't the tragedy that captured the heart of the world. It was the miracle that followed. The story of Bina Ekiye, the girl who had dived into the dark when everyone else ran, began to ripple across the oceans, a testament to a courage that knew no borders and no price. To the world, she was a symbol of hope in a time of shadows, a reminder that the smallest hands could hold the weight of a falling empire. In the high-tech hubs of Seoul, the name of Seong-min was spoken in hushed tones, but now it was joined by the name of the girl who had saved him. Reporters gathered outside the corporate headquarters, their cameras flashing like a sea of artificial stars, all searching for a glimpse into the life of the child who had defied the river. The data moved at the speed of thought, streaming through the air in an invisible web of information, carrying Bina's face into the homes of strangers who would never touch the water of the Delta. She became a global phenomenon, a hero for a generation that hungered for something real in a world made of glass and numbers. Every post, every headline, every broadcast was a brick in a bridge that was being built between two worlds that had never known each other. Far away in a quiet house in Seoul, 7-year-old Hannah watched the screen, her small hands pressed against the glass as she saw the girl who had brought her papa back. The distance between them felt like nothing in that moment, the language of the heart overcoming the thousands of miles of salt and wind. The ripples of Bina's act were no longer just a local story. They were a movement, a force of nature that was changing the way the world measured value. People began to reach out, to offer help, to share the story until it reached the highest boardrooms and the humblest streets. The world was watching, and for a brief moment the noise of the machine fell silent, replaced by the collective heartbeat of a humanity that had finally found something worth holding on to. Today will be better, the world whispered, and for once it didn't feel like a lie. The sky above the Delta was no longer a source of terror, but a vast open canvas of gold and violet as the sun began to climb over a horizon that finally held a different promise. The world had moved on from the smoke and the wreckage, but Seong-min had not forgotten the debt that was written in the mud and the blood of the riverbank. He returned not with the cold distance of an executive, but with the quiet, steady resolve of a man who had found his soul in the dark. He didn't just send messengers or wire funds through silent bank accounts. He came himself, his presence a living bridge between the towers of Seoul and the wooden walkways of the village. He had lived his life believing that power was a shield, but as he stood before Bina and her father, he realized that true power was the ability to change a destiny. The transformation began with the water. A new boat sat at the edge of the river, its hull strong and wide, built to withstand the storms and the currents that had once threatened to swallow Bina's father whole. It was more than wood and paint. It was a tool of dignity, a way for a man who had given everything to finally hold something of his own. Beside it, the small, sagging shack was gone, replaced by a house made of stone and light, a home that didn't creak in the wind or let in the damp chill of the night. Bina watched it all with a quiet, wide-eyed wonder, her small hands tracing the smooth walls that now protected her brother and her father from a world that had once given them nothing. But the greatest gift was not made of stone or wood. Seong-min knelt before Bina, his eyes reflecting a light that was soft and real. He handed her a folder, the crest of the Maritime University gleaming on the cover. A full scholarship that reached out into the years ahead, promising a future that stretched far beyond the edge of the Delta. He was giving her the world she had saved him for, a chance to learn the secrets of the sea and the sky so that she would never be invisible again. Her father watched from the doorway, his face etched with a joy that was too big for words, his shoulders finally free of the weight he had carried for a lifetime. Bina smiled. a soft, real smile that touched her eyes, as she realized that the lies of the past were finally being replaced by a truth she could hold on to. Today was better, and for the first time the promise was kept. Another lie. The morning was a quiet transition of light and shadow, the sun rising over the delta with a soft, persistent glow that made the water look like a path of hammered gold. For Bina, the river had always been the beginning and the end of her world, a constant companion that dictated the rhythm of her days and the depth of her dreams. But as she stood on the muddy bank, a small bag clutched in her hand, she realized that the current was finally carrying her away. The wooden canoe she had known her entire life sat bobbing in the shallows, a silent witness to the girl who was no longer just a fruit seller or a fisherman's daughter. She was someone who had stared into the mouth of the abyss and come back with a strength that could no longer be contained by the mangroves and the silt. Her father stood beside her, his face a map of pride and a sorrow that he tried to hide behind a steady, forced smile. He had spent his life protecting her from a world that gave them nothing, and now he was watching her step into a future that he could barely imagine. "You have the folders?" he asked, his voice thick with a weight that made the air feel heavy. Bina nodded, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of his hands that had paddled her through every storm. She wanted to tell him that she was afraid, that the city and the university felt like a vast, unknown ocean, but she saw the hope in his gaze and she kept the truth to herself. This was the dream they had paid for in fire and oil, and she wouldn't let it slip away. The vehicle waited at the edge of the road, its engine a low, steady hum that spoke of a world that never stopped moving. Bina looked back at the village one last time, at the small stone house that Seong-min had built and the quiet, innocent stretch of the river where the plane had once fallen. It felt like a memory already, a piece of a life that belonged to a girl she barely recognized. She stepped into the car, the soft seats and the cool air a final sharp contrast to the life she was leaving behind. As the delta began to recede through the window, a green expanse that held her history in its murky depths, Bina felt the first pull of the horizon. She was leaving the river, but as she closed her eyes, she knew the river would always be a part of her. Today was better, she whispered to the wind, and for once the lie felt like the truth. Another lie. The sky above Seoul was a vast, shimmering sea of glass and light, the towering buildings reaching upward like silver needles to touch a horizon that felt infinite and untouchable. For Bina, the city was a world made of polished stone and silent speed, a place where the air was crisp and the ground didn't give way beneath her feet. She stood in the center of the great hall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was no longer the girl in the oil-streaked deep, but as she looked at the reflection of the massive chandeliers in the marble floor, she felt a familiar weight in her chest. She had traveled across oceans and through clouds to be here, but the distance between the delta and this palace of steel still felt like a chasm that no bridge could truly cross. Then the heavy doors at the end of the hall opened, and the silence was broken by the light, hurried sound of footsteps. Hannah ran toward her, her small face a mask of pure, unfiltered joy, her eyes shining with a light that Bina recognized from the dreams of a father who had refused to let go. There were no cameras here, no boardrooms or executives, only the raw, naked truth of a family made whole. Seong-min stood behind his daughter, his expression a quiet mix of pride and a gratitude that had no bottom, watching as the two worlds finally collided. He had spent his life building a kingdom, but as he saw the girl from the river standing in his home, he knew that this moment was the only thing that truly mattered. Hannah didn't stop until she reached Bina, throwing her arms around her waist and burying her face in the rougher fabric of the girl's dress. She hugged her tightly, her small frame shaking with an emotion that words could never capture. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady breath that reached through the years and the miles. "Thank you for bringing my papa back." Bina froze for a heartbeat, the weight of the city and the strangeness of the light vanishing in the heat of the embrace. She leaned down and held the child back, her own eyes filling with a warmth that was soft and real. The river was far away now, its smoke and its fire a fading memory, but in the quiet of this hug, she realized that the current had carried her exactly where she was meant to be. Bina smiled, a real smile that touched her soul as she looked at Seong-min and then back at the girl in her arms. She had nothing when she dived into the dark, but here in the center of the light she realized she had everything. Sometimes the smallest act of courage can ripple across oceans and change destinies forever. The world was quiet now, almost innocent, as if it had always been waiting for this moment of peace. Today was better, Bina thought, and as she held Hannah closer she finally knew it wasn't a lie. Another lie.